Today, I'm going to take a look at how far the training of the world's best triathletes has come. Has it changed completely? Or hardly at all? I've been speaking to the 2025 Ironman World Champ, Casper Stornes, and 2011 and 2008 and 2009 Ironman World Champ, Craig Alexander, about their training in the lead up to their big wins on the biggest stage in all of triathlon. And I'll be looking specifically at their training week, 6 weeks out from that big win. How did they compare? What has changed over the last 14 years? Have there actually been big leaps in training science and methodology? And just how many hours do Ironman World Champs actually train?
This year I've gone more into feeling, but I have actually thrown away the heart rate monitor.
It was probably a little bit more intuitive back then.
The inner clock is kind of saying if I'm over or under.
I had a good understanding of the theory and I just sort of applied that in sort of an overarching way. It wasn't like I was tracking all these data points every single day.
When you are in competition, no one cares if you have 2 in lactate.
When we look at the speeds, times, and even competition level of the world's best Ironman athletes, there have been some major leaps in performance since Craig Alexander took the title of World Champion back in 2011. Now, we obviously can't compare the Nice, France course with the Kona, Hawaii course for times, but comparing the Kona 2024 times with Craig Alexander or Crowe's times shows there has been a massive performance improvement. Patrick Langer won Kona in 2024 in a time of 7 hours, 35 minutes and 53 seconds, with splits of 47.09 for the swim, 4:06.22 for the bike, and 2:37.34 for the run. 13 years earlier, Craig Alexander won Kona in 8 hours, 3 minutes and 56 seconds, 28 minutes slower, with splits of 51.56 for the swim, 4:24.05 for the bike, and 2:44.03 for the run. Now, the swim we can mostly ignore. Conditions are going to be the major factor there. But 6 minutes 37 faster on the run and a whopping 17 minutes 43 faster on the bike in 2024. But what is it that has led to these major speed improvements? Better bikes? Better shoes? Better training? Better nutrition? Or is it all of the above? Of course, it is all of the above, to a certain extent. But talking to the world champs from 2025 and 2011 reveals some interesting aspects of their training. Surprisingly similar, but also surprisingly different. This is Craig Alexander's big training week, 6 weeks out from Kona 2011. It is handwritten in fairly neat handwriting. Of course, there's not a whole lot of detail, no TSS scores, of course, and being handwritten, there is no option to analyze it any further, really. But picking Craig's brain about this, and it seems he remembers most of it incredibly clearly. And this is Casper Stornes' training week, that same number of weeks out from his win at the Ironman World Champs in Nice, 14 years later in 2025. His is, of course, on TrainingPeaks. We don't have all the detail from each session, but we have the gist of it, and the bigger sessions. I'm going to sit down and dig through all the numbers of those training weeks of Casper Stornes and Craig Alexander, so no need to pause there and screen grab those fascinating weeks. But before I did, I wanted to ask them about the context where this week fitted into their training. What had they done before, and what were they planning to do after?
So in the past, if you'd won Kona, you could just turn up in Kona, whereas 2011, you had to do one, you had to validate. So I had gone through the whole qualification period and not validated because I was planning on doing Ironman Australia. Got sick, missed all of May in training, and then we travelled up to Boulder in June. And really the qualification window was closing. And so I just jumped in and did Coeur d'Alene. The end of June, I'd literally done 3 weeks of training. I didn't do anything super hard. I was at altitude. I just did some tempo stuff, but mainly just topped up the endurance bucket with some long runs and long rides, didn't go overboard because I had a good preparation leading up to Ironman Australia. So I'd got most of the training in before I got sick. So I was starting what I would call my Ironman build up on my Kona prep, probably coming from a different place, having done an Ironman later in the year, but also coming off of 4 or 5 weeks where I didn't train.
Crowe had a bit of an unusual year. I mean, he was back on track, but he had that illness all May, and he was kind of playing catch-up to get ready for both 70.3 Worlds and then just 4 weeks later, the Ironman World Championships. Unlike Casper Stornes, who actually had raced Ironman Frankfurt 11 weeks out and then didn't have any racing in between that race and the Ironman World Championships. No 70.3s, no trips anywhere, just training. My next question was, where did they train?
So I was up at altitude. I was at like 1,820 meters, in Boulder, Colorado. Great place to prepare for the 70.3 Worlds that year because almost the same time zone and very similar climate. Hot, but dry heat, no humidity, very dry heat.
We were in Fontrome training at 1,800 meter. So we feel that it's a good balance between getting on race pace and low enough. And it's a good place since it was in the French Pyrenees and it's kind of the same roads as in Nice. So it's a good place to be in general for training.
I then asked the first question that got something of a surprising answer, at least from one of our world champions. What did you use to record your training?
Early in my career, nothing really. I was just a poor uni student when I started and couldn't afford a heart rate monitor, which was, I think, the training tool of choice back then. But what I did have was a tertiary degree in physiotherapy, or I was actually partway through it when I started doing triathlon. So I understood about training zones and I guess the different elements that you needed to train up to be a good endurance athlete. And, when I first went up to altitude, I did dive a bit deeper into just monitoring heart and things like that to see how I was responding. And I did a lot of it just to feel. By the time I got to Ironman racing later in my career, I'd had 10 or 15 years racing, the best guys in the world at the shorter distances. And you learn about your body and you got all this information and these signals and cues that your body gives you. And it was probably a little bit more intuitive back then because it had to be. When I did my first Ironman in 2007, I got an SRM power meter put on my bike. They were state of the art back then. They were very heavy though, and accurate. They were accurate, which I think is the most important thing, but they were very heavy.
Nothing really surprising there. Crowe was using cutting-edge technology, but that was a power meter back in 2011. I then asked Casper the same thing, expecting, as you do, the Norwegians to be using all the cutting-edge technology, heart rate monitors, lactate devices, muscle oxygen meters, even core temperature sensors.
This year, I've gone more into feeling, actually.
So,
of course, I use the lactate a little bit, but I have actually thrown away the heart rate monitor, the core, the Moxie, so I haven't used so much tools except of the lactate measurement sometimes. So I've, basically just gone by feeling for every session, and then here and there, if I feel now I need to test a little bit, then I take a lactate measurement mid-session or just over mid-session to just see if I'm correct. But I feel now the inner clock is kind of saying if I'm over or under, and I felt that's been good actually for knowing the body better, since when you are in competition, no one cares if you have 2 in lactate or 1 in lactate. You need to go with the flow and go by pacing all the way. So I've gone a bit back to the roots, as we say, to the junior days kind of.
There you have it, folks. Training may have moved on, but it isn't because the pros are recording every little bit of data on their devices. Which begs the next question. Given that pros these days have whole teams around them, how does your coach know what you're doing if you aren't recording it?
So we are self-coach. Probably many knows that by now. But into this season we decided to be self-coached, and we sat down in January and made a plan. And then we were saying that we should have some normal basic LT2 training or zone 3 and have it more extensive to just drag it and push it. So we still get a high volume in the threshold, but still holding the threshold. So the threshold is, of course, quite over the race pace we're going to do in the race. But for Nice, it was good to... you need to have some overpower. Also, since you have the hills, you need to push power. So you can't just go on like the normal Ironman pace. You need to could go up and down in power and be comfortable there.
I was self-coached. So I had worked with different coaches throughout my career. When I first went up to race in Ironman, I worked with a guy called Nick White, who was working for Carmichael Training Systems. He was from Arizona, Carmichael Training Systems were based in Colorado Springs. I was in Boulder. But he was the guy who got me to put the power meter on in 07, and I worked with Nick in 07 and 08. And I can't even remember why we went our separate ways, but that was a great collaboration. He was awesome. He had just always had awesome ideas, and like any good collaboration, the flow of information went both ways. We tried a few different things, but in 2011, I was doing writing my own programs.
At this point, I nearly gave up on making this video. I was kind of counting on these two being polar opposites, that the Norwegians were recording absolutely everything and saving all that data to pore over later, either themselves or by some scientific advisor. And Crowe being the exact opposite, with his handwritten training prescribed and then handwritten recording of that training. But still, we did have quite the time capsule provided to us by Crowe, so it was worth digging a little bit deeper to see what we could glean from all this information at our fingertips.
For the most part, midweek, I just jump in with the squad. Dave Scott was coaching on deck. His sister Jane was. There was a few really good coaches. Another pure swim coach called Grant, who used to train out of Scott Carpenter Pool, a 50-metre pool, so I'd often go there. I'd usually swim long course twice a week in the 50-metre pool up in Boulder, and they were usually the longer sessions, 5 to 6K. And we did a lot of VO2 max swimming, a lot of shorter, faster swimming. But I just completely handed that responsibility off to the swim coach, because as much as they were coaching swimmers, there were a lot of triathletes in those squads training up for the same races that I was. So the structure was kind of what we needed to get ready for, a 1900 metre swim at 70.3 worlds or 3.8 K swim at the Ironman World. So I left all the swimming up to the swim coach.
Without much specific details of their sessions from either of them, we know that Crowe was swimming 20 to 22 Ks this week and Casper around 25. And partly this difference is probably that the swimmers moved on a little bit in Ironman. You can't really just sit in the group and keep your powder dry for later on in the race. These days, they're swimming a little bit faster and there is no room for error. However, without more details, either recorded in the Crowe's handwritten notes or on Casper's training diary, we can't really draw many more conclusions than that. So let's move on to the biking.
So what I used to do was, if I did the long ride, I would, particularly in July, August, there would always be some element of intensity in the back half of the long ride. So I think one of those long rides I sent you, there was quite a bit of Ironman or over Ironman pace. So I used to do the Big Thompson climb, which you would remember was a 40K climb. And I would sit at just below 70.3 power usually. So I'd sit sort of over 4 watts per kilo on that climb, but under 4.5 watts per kilo. And then I'd get down on the flat and usually do a 20K, 2 20K time trials or a 40K time trial. And then there would be usually a longer run off the bike. But because I also had 70.3 watts coming up, I would also do 2 sessions a week, like usually one motor pace session on the bike, which was just, harder, much harder efforts, well over 5 watts per kilo. Yeah, the structure was always the same. Long ride Wednesday, Saturday, they were usually about 100. I used to do the same loop most of the time, which for those who lived in Boulder was the Big Thompson along to Estes Park. So you're up over 8,000 or 9,000 feet for 3 or 4 hours and then drop down. So that was 195K. I'd do that ride twice a week. I'd do the shorter St. Vrain loop there, which is about 120K. I'd do that on Mondays and Fridays. So I was doing 195K Wednesday, Saturday, 120K Monday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday. Tuesday was usually a bike trainer session, threshold, and Thursday was normally like a motor pace. So I've got the intensity in on Tuesdays, Thursdays. But yeah, big mileage. So you can see if you're doing 195 twice a week and 120 twice a week, you're already at over 600K there. So
the biking I did find interesting. Not so much that Crowe was doing big mileage. I think that was pretty normal back then. But that he was trying to play catch up.
I did my first Ironman at 33 years of age, so I didn't have a 5 or 6 year apprenticeship period. I didn't think. I thought I had to hit the ground running. So I wanted to fast track things. But what I did think was a lot of the guys I was racing when I stepped up had been doing it 6 or 7 or 8 years. So I felt that they had a lot of head start in terms of experience and that strength, that really deep embedded strength and endurance that you either get from racing Ironman or doing big training weeks. So I had to just do some big training weeks, and my theory was to do 2 4-week blocks each year that were just huge, and that's pretty much what I did my whole Ironman career. I was having to bounce between the intensities because I was training for 2 world championships that were different speeds. When I stepped up to Ironman, I felt like I was giving away a lot to the more experienced guys in terms of just that really deep embedded strength endurance they had. I'd come from short course. Like, I'd lived in the US doing the Lifetime Fitness series and the short course races with probably 3 or 4 half Ironmans a year. And I wanted to be competitive straight out of the gate in Ironman, so I knew I had to log that kind of mileage. And it's funny, I arrived on those mileages and that sort of structure. Long brick Wednesday, semi-long run Thursday, long brick Saturday, long run, double run Sunday. But everyone was sort of doing that anyway. Every athlete you spoke to was training for Ironman, had something similar to that. You know, I wasn't inventing the wheel or reinventing the wheel there. And I just happened to come across Mark Allen's book. Or actually, it was a different book. I think it was called The Law of Running, but there was a chapter on Mark Allen in the book, and it had his mileage, and it was very similar. I'd just written my plan, and when I read that chapter, I thought, okay, I'm sort of in the ballpark here.
But what was interesting was that Casper was doing literally half of the biking of Crowe. Now, given that he was 6 weeks out from the Ironman World Championships, but Crowe had a 70.3 World Championships in just 2 weeks after this week we were looking at, he was still doing 700 Ks of biking. Casper, by contrast, did 421 kilometers of biking. And he didn't have a 70.3 coming up. He didn't have any races coming up for more than 6 weeks before the Ironman World Championships. On to the running. And this was almost the complete opposite to the bike, where Crowe did 3 run days with a Friday brick and a Thursday and Sunday double run days. Casper, on the other hand, ran every single day. 7 days, at least an hour every single day. In fact, and not to give too many of his secrets away, I looked through the rest of his training all the way up until that race in Nice. And in those whole 6 weeks, Casper took a grand total of 1 day off running in the whole 6 weeks. And that was the Tuesday before the race. He did pretty much an hour or more of running every single day, with a few shorter sessions in the last week before the race. Crowe and I discussed this and pretty much agreed with the most likely explanation for this.
One thing I think of what would have helped me in today's era and generation is a couple of things. Well, the equipment's better. I think the running shoes would have enabled my legs to, I would have liked to have run more, but we were, as you would remember, the shoes, it was almost like running in bare feet. Everyone was about minimalistic shoes, and my legs used to just get sore. So I think having that new foam and the greater stack heights, and also the carbon plate, although I wouldn't have trained in the carbon plate all the time, I would have picked and chosen what sessions to do with the carbon plate, but just that extra foam, the stack height, I think I could have recovered better and got more running in.
It should be said, looking at Casper's training week, that with the exception of intervals on Thursday and Sunday, pretty much all of his running was done at 5 minutes per kilometer or slower, a pretty pedestrian pace for someone of Casper's caliber. So what were their favorite sessions? Let's first look at Crowe's favorite session.
It was an area that I picked out, Monarch Road, which you would remember, Monarch Road in Boulder. It was part of the Ironman 70.3 course, but it was a dirt road, so it wasn't super quick, but it was slightly uphill one way and slightly downhill the other. So you got that strength sort of grind up the hill, and then the leg turnover coming down the hill, trying to work on free speed technique. Because as you know, Vegas was the same, but particularly Kona, it wasn't a flat run. There was a lot of sections of slight false flats, areas where you could get free speed if you could get the leg turnover going. So, all my training sessions were sort of designed around being very specific to what the demands of the race were that I was training for.
So Crowe's favorite session, 10 by 1 miler. Casper's? Well, he did 3 by 2K and 6 by 1K. So really, not that different. 14 years later and remarkably similar. I then delved a little bit deeper into the brick sessions, because Casper's one hard run session that week was done on the back of a 3-hour bike, and Crowy's wasn't. But actually, I looked at Crowy's training a couple of weeks earlier, and he had done a 3-hour bike with 10 by 1 milers off the bike. So 14 years later, and remarkably similar training.
I was a big fan of running off the bike, but I just think you got to be careful when you're at altitude and it's hot and they're longer sessions. But the longer brick sessions were more to dial in around Ironman threshold and that Ironman sustained pace. But because I also had 70.3 worlds coming up, I would also do 2 sessions a week, like usually one motor pace session on the bike, which was just, harder, much harder efforts, well over 5 watts per kilo. And also I did a run session, which I'm not sure if it was in one of the weeks, but usually one run a week. I was doing something like 8 by 3 minutes or 5 by 5 minutes, and they were at pretty much around 3 minute per K pace.
So what about indoor training? Because if I had to isolate one thing that is technologically advanced more than anything else in the world of triathlon, it is probably indoor training.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, I ride on Zwift now. I love it. I think it makes it more engaging. I think you can, is it something that came about because of the pandemic? I don't know. I feel like indoor training was starting to get a lot better even before 2020. I mean, these platforms were starting to pop up everywhere, and just the hardware was better. The trainers were better where you remove your back wheel. But yeah, 20 years ago, the Cyclops was kind of like the cutting edge, but they were nowhere near as good as the trainers these days. But I did those sessions once a week usually because I just felt you got a lot of bang for buck. There's no coasting, there's no traffic lights, there's no downhill. You've got to power up the whole time. A 90-minute session indoors is the equivalent of probably 2 hours or more outdoor riding. You can be really, I used to do a lot of sessions like 8 lots of 10 minutes at, 70.3 plus power, or 4 lots of 20 minutes, 4 lots of 30 minutes at Ironman power, Ironman to Ironman 70.3 power, somewhere in that range. And they were hard sessions. Like you say, you'd have the music blasting. You'd rip through a lot of back tires as well. You were having to change your back tires a lot. And it wasn't quite the same feel. One thing I'll say about the new trainers is they simulate riding on the road so well. You feel like you're on the road with those Bluetooth. They connect up to the platforms, the change in terrain. It's changed the game. And I know, all the current crop of athletes, they use it, as they should. I think that's one of the best training tools of the last 10 years. So
I remember doing those hard yards, facing a wall, your legs just absolutely no feedback from the trainer whatsoever. It was brutal. It's come along a long way, and it's definitely a tool these days, as Crowy says, that today's pros are using a lot. Except Casper didn't use it at all.
Kristen had with like a balancing roller, but we didn't use it one time. But we were prepared to be inside, but we didn't, since it was so good weather all the time. So then it was better to be outside, be comfortable on a TT bike.
Of course, another factor in all pros' arsenal these days is strength and conditioning training. So, of course, I asked our world champions about that.
There's a lot of exercises in the gym where the strength gains transfer really well out into the real world of swim, bike and run. But it's timing and getting the strength gains, but then being able to maintain them without being counterproductive to the bread and butter of what you need to be doing out on the road. So I would often do most of my heavy lifting December, January, less sets, less reps, but heavier weight, and try and really push those strength gains in. And then as I moved into race season and I guess April or March through to October was more about maintaining those strength gains. So working on the strength really specifically then, like with low cadence, high resistance, riding, a lot of hill riding, hill running, paddle swimming. So real specific strength work, but still doing sessions in the gym where I was maintaining the strength gains that I'd got earlier in the year. And
Casper told me he did 2 core sessions a week early in the season and then reduced it to 1 core session later on in the season. And in fact, the week we looked at, he did 1 hour on the Monday, and I looked at the following week and he did nothing at all. So significantly less than Crowe, and no lifting of heavy weights at all. What didn't come up in my discussion with either of these world champs was treatment, physio, and massage. So I sent them both messages afterwards to ask them about this, and I got this pretty surprising answer from Casper. When I'm home in Bergen, I do sometimes do treatment like physio massage, but not on camp. And that was the end of the message. He doesn't get any treatment whatsoever. So I asked Crowe what he used to get, and he said, well, he tried to sleep a lot, 8 hours most nights, and often an afternoon nap. He jumped in Boulder Creek most days, so basically an ice bath, and he did a lot of functional work in the gym, which helped recovery, and got a regular massage. He said, I also love Normatec boots as well, and I was in them every day.
Also, we did some heat training also in Font-Romeu. So like took on some extra clothing and then tried to sweat a lot. So also when we came to, that was maybe the end of Font-Romeu, we did some heat. And then in Bonds, we did more. There was also a bit hotter. So then, and also into race week, I did some heat sessions also to not lose the heat adaptation into the race. Even if it wasn't the hottest race, I think it's good also to, push the core and push the body in that way and learn and get the body to sweat and get the core up. Yep. So, we did some of that in altitude and after altitude for the race.
Now, clearly, nutrition plays a major role in winning an Ironman World Championship. In fact, so much of a role that there was so much to discuss that I've actually recorded all of it, asked them all the questions, and with the help of a precision fuel and hydration sports scientist, we're going to dig into all of those numbers in a completely separate video, because this video would be 2 or 3 times as long if we tried to do it here, and it is fascinating. How far nutrition has come in the last 14 years is a bit mind-boggling. It might actually be the biggest performance difference. Subscribe now, because that video coming to the channel soon. So given all this swimming and biking and running, how did their total volumes compare? Now, Crowe did a total of 29 hours in this week, but bearing in mind that this was only 2 weeks out from a 70.3 World Championships, and he had already reduced his run mileage by around 40%. In fact, I looked a couple of weeks earlier, and he was closer to 35 hours of training. I asked him if this was normal or if this was a big push in the lead up to the World Championships.
Numbers I tried to hit were, and I said, as again, my push phases were always the same. One in January, one in July, August. And the numbers in August particularly were 5 swims a week, so 25K a week, 700 to 800 a week on the bike, and usually about 120 of running. So I was close to 40 hours those weeks. I was around 40 hours usually I think in 07, in 08, I did 4 weeks of it, and I handled it so well that in 09, I bumped it up to 5 weeks. So my push phase became 5 weeks of that kind of volume. And the structure was always the same. As I said, when I stepped up to Ironman, I felt like I was giving away a lot to the more experienced guys in terms of just that really deep embedded strength endurance they had. I'd come from short course. Like I'd lived in the US doing the Lifetime Fitness series and the short course races with probably 3 or 4 half Ironmans a year. And I wanted to be competitive straight out of the gate in Ironman, so I knew I had to log that kind of mileage.
By comparison, Casper did a total of 30 hours and 52 minutes in this week. So was this normal, or was this an increase in volume or decrease in volume? Well, I looked at his next few weeks, and the following week was a little higher at 33 hours. Before the week after that, it dropped to 29 hours 40. And then he moved to Vence, near Nice, for the final prep before the race. So I'd say about normal. So what can I conclude after pouring through all of this information? How much has training actually changed in the last 14 years? Well, surprisingly little, actually. Not that much at all. Now, obviously, I'm concluding all of this with a sample size of just 1 or 2 athletes, but I guess that's the nature of World Championships. There is only 1 a year, so you only get 1 World Champion to compare to each year. I'm sure there are other world champions out there who do things vastly different to what Casper and Crowe did. But actually, one of my main candidates for doing that would be Christian Blumenfeld. And Christian Blumenfeld was mostly training with Casper Stornes. The real secret to winning Ironman World Champs is the same today as it was 14 years ago, which is probably the same as it was 40 years ago. Consistent daily hard work on top of consistent daily hard work for years. And of course, on top of that, learning your own physiology and what you can handle day in and day out to do that consistent daily hard work. What revelation did you find most surprising? Let us know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like if you enjoyed this video. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss all the rest of our videos, including that very interesting one on the nutrition of these two Ironman World Champions.